Good day, class. I am Professor Aqua, your subject teacher in English 11, Purposive Communication. So how are you? I hope you are all right despite of the trial times of pandemic, but nevertheless, you just have to accept the reality and embrace the new normal. And by doing so, please always be reminded that during the new normal, wherever you are, you still need to protect yourself against the spread of the COVID-19 virus. So wherever you are, always wash your hands frequently. Cover coughs and sneezes. Avoid touching your face. Avoid crowded places and limit time in enclosed spaces or practice social distancing. And keep a distance of at least 1 to 2 meters from the others. Regularly disinfect frequently touched objects and surfaces and on yourself, and isolate yourself from others if feeling unwell and seek care if needed. So always stay safe even if you are at home, and that is an advice from the World Health Organization. So for our discussion for today, our topic will be models of communication. So as we've talked during our last meetings, when we speak of communication, the only time we could say that it is a successful communication if both of the parties of the sender and the receiver interprets or understands the message the same way. We need to say there is a mutual understanding of what is meant by that message. That is the time we could say that your communication is a successful one. Okay? Moreover, again, we need to always understand that communication is a complex process. Okay, it said so because there are a lot of factors that we need to consider and understand. And it is difficult to determine where or with whom a communication encounter starts and ends. Okay, it can sometimes be helpful to consider different communication models. Now, the communication model as our topic for today will help us better understand that scenario. Okay, so there are different questions that will help you guide through this chapter. But let us understand first that models of communication simplify the process by providing a visual representation of the various aspects of a communication encounter. Okay, what is communication encounter? Communication encounter simply means the involvement of the sender and the receiver. It's been said that it is encounter because there are factors along the way that might interrupt your communication, and we call it the communication barriers. Okay, it might be an environmental factors or your surroundings, the noises you have, and many more. Okay, some models explain communication in more detail than others, but even the most complex model still doesn't recreate what we experience in even a moment of communication encounter. Models still serve as a valuable purpose for students of communication because they allow us to see specific concepts and steps within the process of communication, wherein we define communication and apply communication concepts. Okay, so again, communication is a process it is a process that we actually learn day by day. And it's very detailed. And sometimes we do not even know that this is what we do. This is actually what is represented by this communication model. So everything will be understood and clearly explained through understanding the different concepts of communication through these models of communication. Okay? When you become aware of how communication functions, you can think more deliberately through your communication encounters, which can help you better prepare for future communication and learn from your previous communication. Okay? As a human, we always need to practice how could we communicate effectively and efficiently with others. Okay? Because every day, we exchange thoughts with other people. Okay, whoever is around us, we always express what we think of because communication is part of our survival because we express our needs, our wants, and so on. Now, to make this much more meaningful, no, we need to understand moreover the different functions of communication. Because if we come to understand how our communication functions, the main objective, for example, why are we speaking to someone, then we could better understand the process and how are you going to express your thoughts in a way that it will be understood by the both parties. Okay, with this communication model, it will help you understand again how your communication will be effective and also learn from your previous communication. Learn from your previous communication because at some point, no, sometimes we omit errors or we have lapses when we communicate. That's why some of our communication is not that effective. Okay, so there are three models of communication we will discuss, and there are, it is the transmission, interaction, and transaction models. Okay, so let's discuss it one by one. Before that, although these models of communication differ, they contain some elements. Okay? There are different elements under this communication that is essential for us to understand and to substantially explain what is this model all about. The first two models we will discuss, the transmission model, the interaction model, which includes the following parts. What are those? The participants, messages, encoding, decoding, and channels. In communication models, the participants are the senders. Okay, remember that. And the receivers of messages in communication encounter. The message is either verbal or non-verbal content being conveyed from the sender to the receiver. Like for example, when you say hello to your friend, okay, or any message, or hi, hello, you are sending a message of greeting that will be received by your friend. Simple as that. The integral or the internal cognitive process, okay, when we speak of cognitive process, your thinking process that allows participant to send, receive, and understand messages is the encoding and the decoding process. Again, we call it the encoding and the decoding process. That is what we call that is the internal cognitive process. Encoding is the process of turning thoughts into communication. Okay, from your idea, what you think of something, your opinion from your mind, okay, you turn it into communication, meaning to say you verbally express it. Okay, you say it to someone. Okay, that is what we call encoding. As we will learn later, the level of conscious thought that goes into encoding messages varies. Okay, so there are different factors that may vary our encoding process of the message. Decoding, on the other hand, is the process of turning communication into thoughts. Okay, meaning to say we interpret the message. This is the communication, and then you turn it into thoughts. That is decoding. You understand it. You comprehend it. Okay, for example, you may realize you're hungry, and you encode the following message to your roommate. What do you encode? For example, you said to them that I'm hungry. Do you want to get some pizza tonight? Okay, so that is what we call the encoding process, because your mind is telling you that you are hungry, and then you turn it into words. Okay, you express it to your roommate. Okay, that is encoding. Now, they decode your communication, or your roommate as the receiver of the message, decode your communication and turn it back into thoughts in order to make meaning out of it. Okay, so after they hear and receive the message, they will understand, they will absorb your message, and that is when they will make meaning out of their message. Okay, so this is what we've mentioned earlier. What I've mentioned earlier, that sometimes it varies. That is why, as the sender of the message, make sure that your message is expressed accordingly on how you want it to be understood by your receiver. Because sometimes, even if you're saying this one, if the register from you is just okay, sometimes it may appear to be offensive to someone, only because on how you express it or how you choose your words as the sender or who encodes the message. and then sometimes they decode it differently. They understand it differently. So make sure that as the sender, to make your communication effective one, you express your thoughts accordingly. Okay? So again, decoding is the process of turning the communication into thoughts. And of course, we don't just communicate verbally. We have various options, okay, or channels for communication. Encoded messages are sent through a channel, okay, or a sensory route on which a message travels to the receiver for decoding. We have different ways or tools for us to send the message to someone or to encode the message to someone so that the receiver will decode it. Okay, while communication can be sent and received using any sensory route, for example, our senses, sight, the smell, touch, taste, or sound, most communication occurs through visual or sight and or auditory or sound channels. Diba? Just like what they said, diba? In reality, most of the people said that it's difficult to lie to someone who actually really witnessed the scenario or hear the communication, okay, because that is part of the communication. That's the senses, okay. Those are the senses we use that commonly, okay, occurs in communication process. The sense of sight and the sense of hearing, okay. If your roommate, for example, has headphones on and is engrossed in a video game, you may need to get their attention by waving your hands before you can ask them about the dinner. Diba? That is true. Okay? Or for example, your friend is playing Mobile Legend, and then he or she is so busy about it, and then you wanted to offer him or her a food, then they may not hear you because they are distracted. So you may have your non-verbal communication of just waving your hand. That's part of the communication. That is your encoding process, and then they decode it in a way that my friend would like to tell me something, so I need to remove my headphones. Okay. Now let's go over with the different communication models. Let's begin with the linear model. Okay, the linear transmission or the linear or transmission model of communication as shown in the figure. Okay, so this is the figure of linear model of communication. We have the encoding, and then straightforward, the message is sent to the decoder or the receiver of the message. Now, what is the message? Hello, that's the message. And we have the arrow here or the line here represents the channel. Okay, the channel you use to send the message. Okay, and then we have the decoder, the receiver, and then we also have here side by side the noise. Okay, because we could not get away from this. Okay, so what does it tell us something about communication? It describes communication as a linear. Okay, as you can see, it is linear. One-way process in which a sender intentionally transmits a message to the receiver. And that is according to Ellis and McClintock in 1990. Okay? Again, linear model simply explains the linear communication wherein the sender intentionally sends a message to the receiver, meaning the encoder is conscious enough to send the message to the receiver. The model focuses on the sender and the message within a communication encounter. Although the receiver is included in the model as shown in the figure, this role is viewed as more of a target or endpoint rather than part of an ongoing process. Okay, because commonly, as we could see, there is a cycle of arrow because there is an exchange of messages. But with the linear model, it is represented, but that the receiver or the decoder simply just receive the message, nothing more, because that is what is explained by the linear model, simply the target or the receiver of the message. Okay, so we are left to presume that the receiver either successfully receives and understands the message or does not. Okay, so why do you think so? Because the linear model again simply shows the intention of the sender to send the message to the receiver, and then the receiver receives the message. but the receiver do not give a feedback to the sender. Okay, that is not what is explained by the linear model. So there is chances that within this linear model, the receiver may interpret or not interpret the message. Why do you think so? Because we could not assure that they interpret the message correctly because we don't have any feedback. We don't have any answer from the receiver that will justify or that will allow us to verify if our message is understood correctly by the receiver. Because the linear model, once again, simply just sends the message to the receiver, and then the receiver receives the message, nothing more. Okay? These scholars of this linear model who designed the model extended on a linear model proposed by Aristotle centuries before that included a speaker, message, and a hearer, okay, someone who listens or to hear the message. They were also influenced by the advent and spread of new communication technologies of the time, such as telegraphy and radio broadcasting, and you could probably see these technical influences within this model, according to Shannon and Weaver in 1949. Okay, so just imagine, no? Think of a radio or how a radio message is sent from a person in the radio studio to you listening, for example, while you are driving a car. Okay, that is just a simple representation of a linear model. Why? Because when you're just listening to a radio, there's no exact feedback. Like the listener of the radio could just simply or immediately send the feedback to the broadcaster of the radio. So that's a linear model because the listener simply just hear or listen to the news from the radio broadcaster. Okay, that's linear model. The sender is the radio announcer who encodes a verbal message that is transmitted by a radio tower through electromagnetic waves, or what we call the channel, okay, as shown in the figure earlier, and eventually reaches your receiver's ears via an antenna and speakers in order to be decoded. Okay, just like, for example, if we hear showbiz news, okay, and then it is our idol, for example, your idol singer, Gary Valenciano, for example, no? That's the news all about. And then you reacted on it because you idolize that person so much. So you decode the message. And then you express what you feel about it, but the radio announcer could not even interact with how you actually feedback. So it's just simply a message of the radio announcer to the listeners. And then that's it. We call it linear model. Okay? So the radio announcer, okay, the radio announcer doesn't really know if you received their message or not, because the radio announcer could not all the time, or they don't have the device to monitor that this person listens to my message or to the announcement and so on. Okay, but if the equipment is working and the channel is free of static, then there is a good chance that the message was successfully received. Okay, it was just pre-assumptions, okay, but we don't have any validation that it was completely heard by your target audience. Okay, so we call that example linear model. So although the transmission model may seem simple or even underdeveloped to us today, the creation of this model allowed scholars to examine the communication process in new ways, which eventually led to more complex models and theories of communication. Okay, so I hope the linear model communication is clear to everyone. Now, we are done with the linear model as one of the communication models. Out of 3, we will proceed discussing the second model of communication process. We have the interactive model. Okay, so the interactive or interaction model of communication as shown in the figure 2.2.2. Okay, this is the figure. Okay, we have this figure, we have the encoder, and wherein the encoder also serves as a decoder later on. Okay, this sender now becomes also the receiver at the same time. He or she is encoding the message, decoding the message, and then sends the message to the receiver through this communication channel. Okay, for example, the message is, how are you? That's the message. How are you, friend? That's the message. And then now the sender or the receiver now decodes the message, interprets the message that was sent by the sender, and then now the message now is being encoded at the same time of the receiver and sends a feedback to the sender earlier. And the sender earlier will serve now as the receiver of the message. Okay, which means to say during this interactive model, okay, both the sender and the receiver plays its role as the sender and the receiver, the encoder and the decoder at the same time, because there is an interactive exchange of messages. Okay, and then this time the sender now, the receiver earlier becomes the sender, because after decoding and interpreting the message, the sender now, or the receiver earlier, becomes the sender because he or she now encodes the message. How do actually the receiver earlier interprets the message? Okay, he or she now encodes, and then the answer, I'm fine, thank you. And we call that feedback. Okay, we call that feedback. And then in this feedback, we also have the feedback channel. Okay, there is a physical context and the psychological context. So we will understand this later. Okay, so in the interactive model, it describes communication as a process in which participants alternate positions again as the sender and receiver, and then both the sender and the receiver generate meaning by sending messages. Aside from that, receiving messages and giving feedback within physical and psychological context, according to Schramm during 1997. Rather than illustrating communication as a linear, just like what we mentioned earlier, the linear communication model, just simply the sender simply sends a message intentionally to the receiver, and then that's it. Okay, and one of the examples we have earlier is the radio broadcasting, because the radio announcer could not exactly assure that the receiver of the message really receives the message. Okay, and one-way process, we call the linear model as one-way process, but the interactive model incorporates feedback. Okay, from the word itself, interactive. There is an interaction between the sender and the receiver of the message, which makes communication a more interactive and two-way process. Okay, this is what's good about communication, is it is a two-way process, because in any relationship, human relationship, whether that's a work relationship, family relationship, or partner, or your relationship, intimate relationship, friendship relationship, it is very important to have an interaction. We use this model of communication, the interactive model, so that we will also understand the side of others. We are not just consoling with what we think is what we know, but we also do not limit that, and we also hear from the others. That is why interactive model is a two-way process, because what I've mentioned, the mentioned relationships earlier requires this model. Okay, the interactive model. Feedback includes messages sent in response to other messages. For example, your instructor may respond to a point you raise your hand during class discussion, or you may point to have a sofa when your roommate asks you where the remote control is. Or the inclusion of a feedback loop also leads to a more complex understanding of the roles of participants in the communication encounter. Okay, so feedback has a very important role in the interactive model, because with the absence of feedback, that is not two-way process. Okay, remember class, if there is an absence of feedback in the communication process, we could not categorize that as an interactive model. It is a one-way process, and we simply call it what? We simply call it linear model and not interactive model. Interactive model requires the feedback, okay? Just like what is projected on the figure. Rather than having one sender, one message, and one receiver, the interactive model has two sender receivers who exchange messages. Each participant alternates roles as the sender and receiver in order to keep communication encounter going. Okay, very good example of the interactive model is a debate. Okay, for example, you are in a debaters guild organization, and then it's really important to have this interactive model that you exactly responds to what is actually said to you, because the debate demands you to defend your side. Whether you are in an affirmative or a negative side, you need to defend what you stand for. So it requires you to have an interactive model, because the feedback requires you to match or to answer the rebut of someone. Okay? Again, very good example of interactive model is during debate. Okay? And although this seems like a perceptible and deliberate process, we alternate between the roles of a sender and receiver very quickly and often without conscious thought. Okay? This is commonly the problem. This is actually commonly the problem in reality, that sometimes, because we're very interactive with the communication process, sometimes we don't even have second thoughts if we're going to say this or not. Kaya that is why there's a miscommunication between parties. And remember, one of the pressing problem, why is it there are conflicts in our community, is only because of misunderstanding or miscommunication. So make sure that you are conscious enough and making sure that you are interacting, okay, accordingly with someone. Okay, the interactive model is also less message focused and more interaction focused. Okay, whereas in the linear model, it's just one-way process. It's more of the sender. It's more of the sender sending the message all day long. Okay, without any feedback. Just like what I'm doing right now. Okay, what I'm doing right now is a recorded lecture. I call this a linear model because me as your instructor just simply records the lecture that I have. And I don't have any assurance if every one of you will be watching this video or will be interacting with this, because I'm just one-way process of sending the lecture. Whereas we call this, or I will categorize this lecture as an interactive model if I will be conducting a live class. Okay, for example, I am lecturing this interactive model, and then I will be asking, okay, Mr. Santos, okay, Miss Domingo, okay, and Mr. Giamadel, for example. That is the time it becomes an interactive model, okay, because I am using interactive plus discussion. Okay, so in the interactive model, once again, it is more concerned of interaction, and it's less message because simply interacting. Okay, while the linear model focused on how a message was transmitted and whether or not it was received, the interactive model is more concerned with the communication process itself. Okay, so what's good about interactive model is right away uh, you understand if the receiver of your message earlier really understands or interpret your message correctly. Okay, that is the advantage of interactive model. Right away you could get the feedback. Right away you could get the reaction of someone from what you've said to them. Okay, some messages are also unintentionally sent. Okay, therefore, communication isn't just judged effective or ineffective in this model based whether or not a single message was successfully transmitted or received. Okay, so what is meant by that? Even so, that we have this interactive model, and it is an exchange thought of the sender and the receiver. And just like what I mentioned, the advantage is right away you could get the answer or the reaction of the receiver of the message earlier. But the downside of this one, sometimes again, the messages are unintentionally sent. Okay, so we could not exactly or right away assess if this model is effective or not. Still depends upon the sender and the receiver of the message. So that is why the sender and the receiver plays a very important role in the communication process. Because without them and without the call for the higher thinking of understanding or interpreting the message, then the communication will not be as successful as it is. Okay, so once again, this is the interactive model. We have the encoding, decoding by the sender, who also becomes the receiver, and the decoding, encoding, the same of the receiver now becomes the sender, because there will be an exchange of thoughts, okay, with the presence of the feedback. The interactive model takes physical and psychological context into account. What does it mean when we speak of the physical context? It includes the environmental factors in communication encounter. Okay, the physical content, it may matter, or it will really matter. The size, the layout, the temperature, and the lighting of a space influence our communication. Because if the size of the text, the layout, the temperature, and the enough light needed is not that enough, then it may influence the communication process. Just imagine the different physical context in which job interviews take place and how they may affect your communication. Okay, so during the job interviews over the phone, crowded around a table with 8 interviewers or interviewees, and then we have the seating with few people around an extra large conference table. Okay, and then you walk around an office and expect to be interviewed by one-on-one in succession with multiple members of search committee over a period of 3 hours. Whether it's the size of the room or the environmental factors, it's important to consider the role that physical context plays in our communication. Remember that, okay? It will always matter. No matter how good the speaker is and the receiver in decoding the message, still it will matter if the physical context is not that conducive. Okay. On the other hand, we have the psychological context. This includes the mental and emotional factors in communication encounter. For example, stress, no, anxiety, emotions are just some examples of psychological influences that can affect our communication. Okay. Similarly, positive psychological states like experiencing the emotion of love can also affect the communication, because that's really a positive. It's positive emotion that may inspire, for example, the listener to just take everything positively because the love is there. Okay, so that psychological context that may affect the effectiveness of the communication. And then feedback and context help make the interaction model a more useful illustration of the communication process. But the transaction model views communication as a powerful tool that shapes our realities beyond individual communication encounters. So later on, let's discuss about the interaction model. The transactional model. Okay, so as mentioned earlier, okay, linear model is a one-way process of communication model, whereas interactive model is a two-way process because there will be the presence of the sender and the receiver, wherein the only different one is the presence of the feedback. Again, the linear model focus on sending the message by the sender without even notifying or allowing the sender to verify whether the message is understood or not, or received by the receiver. Okay, whereas the interactive model, from the word itself interactive, it requires a feedback. And what's good about interactive model is that it will allow you to immediately respond and interpret the process of communication, where if it will be effective or not. But somehow at some point in time, the interactive model, we couldn't exactly judge if the communication is effective or not, because sometimes the message are sent unintentionally by the sender. Okay, because of the eagerness of people, for example, in sending the message or replying to the sender, then sometimes the reply is an inappropriate or it does not answer exactly the message of the sender. Okay, so we call that the interactive model. Okay, so let's explore now the third communication model, which is actually, we call it the transactional model. Okay, the transactional model, on the other hand, includes a more complex understanding of a context. Again, when we speak of transactional model, you need to interpret the context of communication in order for you to blend with that context. The interaction model portrays context as physical and psychological influences that enhance or impede communication. While in the transactional model, the contexts are important. Okay, it is as important that they focus on message transmission and reception. Since the transaction model of communication views communication as a force that shapes our realities before and after specific interactions occur, it must account for contextual influences outside of a single interaction. Again, you need to contextualize your message in an interaction. To do this, the transactional model considers how the following: the social, relational, and cultural contexts frame and influence our communication encounters. Again, the factors that you need to consider when we speak of the transactional model are the social, relational, and cultural context frame that may influence the communication encounter. Okay. Now, the social context, okay, the social context refers to the stated rules or understated or unstated norms that guide communication. Norms are social conventions that we pick up on through observation, practice, and trial and error. Okay, just like when we are exposed to different community. Okay, for example, you grew up in a community surrounded by this, for example, a culture, a specific culture, and then you expose or you are sent abroad and you're exposed to another culture, then that's you will be culture shock. Okay, but the way you communicate with them still needs or requires you to have the transactional model, because you need to contextualize it socially according to what is norm to that community. Okay, we may not even know we are breaking a social norm until we notice people looking at us strangely, or someone corrects or teases us. Okay, have you ever experienced that? For example, if we blend ourselves to something that is new to us, okay, and some point you will not completely understand or know if you're doing it right until someone corrects you, until someone reacts or teases you on how you actually do it. Okay, so that is just one of the dilemmas of the transactional model. But relational context includes the previous interpersonal history and type of relationship we have with a person. We communicate differently with someone we just met versus someone we've known for a very long time. Okay, that is explained through the transactional model that we have different types or ways of communicating to someone. Okay, we contextualize the way we communicate. Like for example, if we communicate with someone we've known for a very long time, then we find our comfort zone to that someone. Sometimes we communicate with them differently. Okay, like we just tap their back, we crack jokes to them, and sometimes we mention foul words, but it is norm because it is just okay for that person because you've known the person for a very long time. Compared if you talk to someone you just knew for 2 days, yesterday or just now, so it's different one. Okay, we contextualize how we communicate with people around us. We have this what we call initial interactions with people tend to be more highly scripted and governed by established norms and rules. But when we have an established relation context, okay, or relational context, we may be able to bend or break social norms or roles more easily. For example, if you are working, diba? You're working in a company, of course, there's a norm or a norm wherein we formally communicate with someone. Okay, make sure that you send a letter, permission, okay, and so on. That's the norm. But if we used to know the person for a very long time, for example, outside the work, then we communicate to them differently. And we may break social norms. Okay? Cultural context includes various aspects of identity, such as race, gender, nationality, ethnicity, sexual orientation, class, and ability. We all have multiple cultural identities, class, that influence our communication. Remember, we're all different. We're all different in many aspects. So if we come to think and tolerate that differences, then we could easily blend and adjust on how we communicate with different people around us. Of course, you could not choose to just speak English fluently and straight to someone that is not exposed to English language or do not understand easily English language. Okay? Or you could not speak use Magindanaon language to someone who do not even understand the language itself. Okay? So make sure that you bend a little and blend with the person. Okay? We categorize that also under the transactional model because we contextualize. We get to know first the receiver of our messages. Now, some people, especially those with identities that have been historically marginalized, are regularly aware of how their cultural identities influence their communication and influence how others communicate with them. Okay? For example, in our community, okay, there are sometimes people who are misunderstood by the community or not accepted in the community. Then there are cases that they have different ways of communication and they just accept that one. Okay, it's a norm for them. We also categorize that as transactional model. That is why in transactional model, make sure that aside from making sure that there's an interactive communication, okay, it's much more difficult because you need to get to know first your stand, your viewpoint, and your the receiver of the message. Okay, you need to contextualize that one. Conversely, people with identities that are dominant or in the majority may rarely, if ever, think about the role their cultural identities play in their communication. Cultural context is influenced by numerous aspects of our identities and is not limited to race or ethnicity. Okay? So again, transactional model simply requires you to contextualize with what is norm. Interactive model, there is a need for you to have the feedback to call it interactive, whereas the linear model is just a one-way process wherein the sender just simply sends the message to the receiver. And for your activity for this topic, okay, so please be guided with the following questions. First, why do models of anything matter in the real world? Second one, what value do communication models have? Third, how can learning about communication models be helpful to you? Now, how are you going to compile your answers from this? Okay, so for this midterm period, you need to compile your work. Your answers will be encoded. Okay, you encode your answers. This is an essay question. You encode your answers in MS Word, and then the format should be Arial in font style, 12 in font size, and the size of the paper is long. Okay, print that one. Okay, write the date, and the date is April 13. Okay, and then submit that before the midterm examination. We still have many activities to come in each of the lessons. So it's a compilation. It's like a portfolio compilation wherein you need to print and we need to encode, answer, and then print it out and submit it all before the midterm examination. Okay, so make sure you substantially answer the following questions, 1 to 3. Actually, all of the answers can just be answered correctly if you understand the discussion in our topic for today, which is the communication model. Okay, so class, I will be waiting for your answers. So please answer it on time so that your task will not be bombarded. Okay, because I understand that this is not only your subject, but make sure from time to time, if you have free time, make sure to do your tasks. Okay, so thank you everyone. God bless.